The Newsagents.
The government has already been working in advance on a new treaty with Rwanda, which we will finalise in light of today's judgment, so to address the challenges that were raised. But let me say this again, if it becomes clear that our domestic legal frameworks or international conventions are still frustrating plans at that point, I am prepared to change our laws and revisit those international relationships. The British people expect us to do whatever it takes to stop the boats, and that is precisely what this government will deliver.
Rishi Sunak speaking in the Commons. You'd almost think the government had scored a minor victory at the Supreme Court over its Rwanda policy. Instead of which, it was a damning verdict from the Supreme Court justices who found unanimously against the Home Secretary's appeal to allow the deportation of asylum seekers to Rwanda.
And what was the Prime Minister's response to that today? They are frustrating our plans. The Supreme Court agreed with the Court of Appeal that it was unlawful. And the response from our Prime Minister is, they are frustrating our plans. This is UK immigration law they are trying to uphold. And there are many in Rishi Sunak's party right now, 50 or so MPs, who just say, sod it, let's just do it anyway. Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And we've had the Supreme Court ruling, which kind of, when you listen to it, you thought, I bet this is going to be one of those very finely balanced judgments. We've heard this and we've heard that. And on reflection, we've kind of landed here. It was nothing like that. It was absolutely boom. The Home Secretary's case is without merit. The appeals court was absolutely right. It's not just the European Convention on Human Rights, it's everything. There are all sorts of laws that mean this should not go ahead. Although it strikes me that there are still people who misunderstand what the policy is, even in the media, in the way they're explaining it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, John, you're right. Westminster and Home Office, Downing Street, they all expected to lose today. They didn't expect to lose in this way, in such a comprehensive way. But it's just worth rewinding and just thinking about what this policy was all about, because it was so unusual. This is not Sunak's policy. This was a policy from the Boris Johnson and Priti Patel era. It wasn't even Suella Braverman's policy. It was one they chose to continue with. It was a policy to deal with, they said, the government told us, the so-called small boats crisis on the Channel, when it wasn't as severe as it has been over the past couple of years or so. And the policy was this. It was to take people who have arrived irregularly, claiming asylum in the UK, saying that they are refugees from war-torn places around the world, and sending them to a third country, in this case Rwanda, not just while their application for asylum was processed, which has been an idea which has been mooted over the years, but to go one step further, which was to quite literally redirect their asylum claim itself to Rwanda, i.e., if Rwanda, the government of Rwanda, not the government of the UK, assessed that they were indeed genuine refugees with a genuine claim under international law to asylum, they would not just then be sent to the UK for their refugee status, they would become refugees in Rwanda against their will, because there's a reason they've come to the UK. They want to claim asylum in the UK. This has gone through all of the courts, all of the judicial process. One of the lower courts said that it was lawful for the government to do this. The Court of Appeal said that it wasn't. The Supreme Court today has agreed with the Court of Appeal. And the point you raised, John, is crucial. The background to all of this has been to say, Conservative MPs saying, well, if the Supreme Court says that it's not lawful, we must withdraw from the European Convention of Human Rights, because that will be one of the primary bases on which it isn't lawful. What the Supreme Court today said, that it's not just the ECHR that's the problem. It's the Human Rights Act, which is part of the UK government law. It is a whole suite of different UK immigration laws, which go back to 1993, 1994. And it's our obligations under UN refugee treaties as well. So the whole legal architecture to which the government is signed, and let's be honest, they knew they were signed up to when they pursued this policy, none of it allows this Rwanda scheme to take place.
Look, I think it's really important to understand that this isn't a rejection of the whole scheme as an idea. It is a rejection specifically of Rwanda as a safe country. And Lord Reid took, I think, about 17 minutes, to actually get to his point. And he made it very quickly. Lord Reid from the Supreme Court talked about the unanimity of the 5 judges and how they had agreed and backed up the Court of Appeal, who'd also found the same thing, which is that it raised questions about whether Rwanda's undertakings could be relied upon. And it said that Rwanda had a 100% rate of rejection of asylum claims from war zones, from Syria, from Yemen, from Afghanistan. In other words, it would have acted more harshly against people from exactly the kind of countries that we ourselves generally accept claims from. And he also cited what happened in Israel. And I think this is interesting because Israel is often cited as the country that has used the Rwanda scheme. Oh, we're not the first, it has worked, all the rest of it. Israel used the Rwanda scheme between 2013 and 2018. And what it found was that when asylum seekers were applying to Rwanda, which is part of the sort of scheme they set up, Rwanda was saying no. And it was clandestinely moving them to other parts of Africa, to other countries, to other neighbouring places. So Rwanda was never actually fulfilling its obligations.
The point is, within international law, you have to be sure that a person who is a refugee cannot and will not be sent back to their country of origin. Because by definition, if they've fled from that place, they're in danger. What the Supreme Court today said is that the UK government, despite this pretty flimsy agreement that they've negotiated with Rwanda, cannot be sure that Rwanda will not send them back to those countries. That is why it's unlawful.
But then you get the reaction to it. And a Tory MP revitalised the headline from the Daily Mail, Enemies of the People, about the judges who delivered the verdict. They are not enemies of the people. They are judges applying the law of the land by which a liberal democracy works. And then you see Lee Anderson, the deputy chairman of the Conservative Party, going to a Tory grouping and saying, we should just ignore the law. Let's just send them home the day they arrive. And you just think this is such a slippery slope for us as a democracy if we are going to say the law, we can ignore it when we choose to. And these are lawmakers in the House of Commons. These are the people who make the laws. And we saw how that all ended up very happily in the United States of America on January the 6th, where you think we can ignore the laws of the land.
Well, I think that's completely right. But it's worth just dwelling for a moment on just like the incompetence of getting to this decision in the first place, right? The fact of the matter is, today was the climax of a process which, honestly, I mean, I've been covering this now for years. Experts, opponents of the law, international lawyers, basically voices within the Home Office and government itself, all said today was coming, that it was highly likely that at some point a court or the Supreme Court would rule this policy as unlawful. And in that time, it's worth dwelling on what's been lost. Years of effort, bureaucratic effort from the Home Office trying to thread the eye of the needle on this one. £140 million has been given to the government of Rwanda already, and they haven't taken a single asylum seeker. And frankly, after today, it is likely that they never will.
The worst thing about this is they knew this would happen. And we know that they knew this would happen because Rishi Sunak said, whilst admitting defeat in the Commons today, that he was already working on a treaty with Rwanda instead of this scheme that they had. And I was talking to a legal expert who said, look, they've known that they had legal problems with the Rwanda scheme for 2 years. Why didn't they do something legal? He pointed me to the case of Abu Qatada 10 years ago. This was the extremist cleric that Theresa May wanted to deport, and the ECHR had ruled against it because of the potential of Jordan using evidence acquired through torture. So what happened then? They started again. They got a treaty together. They made it clear that Jordan couldn't use evidence that had been acquired through torture, and it worked. And Abu Qatada was deported, and he went back, and they had a special treaty with Jordan. This one was only ever a memorandum of understanding. It wasn't worth the paper it was written on. And this is what the Supreme Court tell you over and over again. They didn't believe Rwanda when they said, oh, yeah, we get it. We'll be fine. We'll abide by the rules. There was no treaty underpinning it. Rishi Sunak knew that, which is why he's simultaneously working on a treaty, which means that for the last 2 years, they could have done something which was substantial. They could have done something which was legally competent instead of just trying to undermine the rule of law in this country.
Well, not surprising that Keir Starmer had his arrows lined up firmly at Rishi Sunak over the way this policy has unfolded.
Now the most ridiculous, pathetic spectacle of all. His Rwanda scheme, cooked up with his National Security Threat Home Secretary, has blown up. He was told over and over again that this would happen, that it wouldn't work, and it was just the latest Tory gimmick. But he bet everything on it, and now he's totally exposed. The central pillar of his government has crumbled beneath him. Does he want to apologise to the country for wasting £140 million of taxpayer cash and wasting his entire time in office?
Mr. Speaker, obviously the person officer didn't hear what I said about our approach to Rwanda, and not least when it comes to stopping the boat.
But this is the point, right? This, to me, exposes two of Sunak's sort of... We've been talking about it all week. The weakness of his political judgment and a critique about him, this idea that he's sort of right across the detail. I think, you can argue that today really casts some doubt on that, in the sense that one of the problems today, wasn't the only problem, was domestic UK legislation. You've got all these Tory MPs coming out and slamming the judges. No. Parliament is sovereign. If Parliament, in the government, who control the timetable of the Commons, want to do something about our UK domestic legislation, they can do it. They have a majority to do it. They have passed not just one, but 2 acts in relation to illegal migration, so-called, and asylum seeking over the past 2 years. In neither of those 2 acts, one of which has gone through under Sunak's watch, have the legal problems been addressed, which the court identified today. And yet Sunak must have known that, and yet all year he has continued with this idea and continued with this rhetoric, again, that wasn't his, he inherited, that this scheme was going to solve the problem. A problem that, again, today, he said was his number one priority. He said all year, we're going to stop the boats. Now, he can say, there are people who've said all year, but when the courts come back and say he can't do it, he can rail against that and can turn it to his advantage. As we've said all year, I think that is just a wrong analysis. The problem is, they can do that, but the problem is, politically, it just makes them look incompetent, if not useless, because they can't exercise and get their will through.
It makes it look like this has become the most expensive Conservative Party press release in history. There is a £140 million price tag attached to a press release saying we're going to send them to Rwanda.
100%.
And every time they try to get to a plane taking off, Suella Braverman's dream, it becomes a nightmare even more. And they won't give up on it, because it would look like so much weakness, and the press release, which has been slavishly taken up by some of the right-wing papers as we're going to send them to Rwanda, would then fall apart.
And it's also awful when you lose your external enemies. It's great when you can bash the EU. Oh, the EU was stopping us from doing all this, and then the EU's gone. Now it's the ECHR until you find out that...
It's not the 80s.
Don't tell anyone. It's your own laws. So much for restoring sovereignty in a post-Brexit age. You have the law, and it is UK law, and suddenly you just have to fight yourselves.
And let's not forget that this policy, and John, you're so right to think about the press release, because let's not forget that this policy, which is we've talked about endlessly, has occupied, the government spent so much political capital on it. In any event, even if the court had said today that it was fine and you can go ahead, it was only ever intended and clear from the agreement that had been reached with Rwanda that they could take a fraction of the total number of people seeking asylum in this country. It was all about the optics. And the optics have not only rebounded on them completely, but it has cost all of us a huge amount of money into the bargain. And now it's created this enormous disorder again within the Conservative Party. This is now turning into a not insignificant crisis for Sunak's premiership, for a policy that wasn't even his. And again, that calls into question his political judgment.
Yeah.
And, today, once again, now the whole talk is from Tory MPs asking whether the government is going to withdraw from the ECHR, which James cleverly in the Commons, the new Home Secretary, basically made clear wasn't going to happen.
The Prime Minister has said that if our domestic legal framework frustrates our plans, he is prepared to change our laws. But I will inform the House we are not going to put forward proposals simply to manufacture an unnecessary row for political gain. We have a plan to deliver the Rwanda deal.
So look, a massive change in Conservative policy then. They're not going to put forward a plan just to create an unnecessary row within the party.
Oh, wow.
So I think, so we should mark the date, we should mark the time. This is not now going to be government policy.
Then why did they done it up to now? This is the point again with Sunak chopping and changing the entire time, entertaining this idea all year that this might happen. Now, it might not happen. Something, by the way, that was never going to happen. The ECHR is underwritten into the Human Rights Act, which is itself underwritten into the Good Friday Agreement, and it's part of the TCA, the trade agreement we have with the EU. There was never a world where it was going to happen, and they've entertained it anyway.
The extraordinary thing about this whole thing is when we woke up this morning, there was really good news for the government.
Yeah.
There was really good news on the inflation figures, brought it down to 4.6%. I think many of us listening to that were surprised. We know that it's one of his 5 tasks, 5 key steps, that before the end of the year he wanted to halve inflation. It's now been done. In a different world where he hadn't wasted 2 years and £140 million on something that was never going to happen, which was incompetent, unethical and overexpensive.
And wasn't his policy.
It was his policy. Then we would actually be talking first and foremost about inflation and what that would mean, and whether it gave him, a fillip in a week where he sort of tried to change the party's fortunes and the look of cabinet around a lot. As it is, I don't think it was even one of sort of 4 questions in PMQs, because actually all this superseded everything else.
Win some, you lose some. And Rishi Sunak lost a big one today, and the win looks like it's marginal in comparison, and this is going to go on.
I mean, it isn't really. I think that's a really good point, because if you stopped most people in the streets of the UK, I'm sure most people care more about the rate of inflation than they do about the small boats.
But they're not going to hear about it now.
Well,
Not today,
it's a really interesting thing, isn't it? That if you step back and say, do more people care about the cost of groceries, the cost of living, than they do about small boats? I bet you would find they do. But the Tories' own narrative has been that people really care about the small boats. So now they've set up this sort of place where people massively care about the small boats and you can't stop them.
Emily, you and I were talking on the US edition about cost of living and the way Americans feel right now, that the statistics might be that inflation has fallen and all the rest of it, but people are still feeling that the cost of filling up the car with petrol and getting a basket full of groceries is still expensive. Look, inflation has come down. It doesn't mean that prices have come down. It means that prices are rising less quickly. So there's not going to be any feed through, I don't think, in terms of public opinion for a long time to come yet, on the fact that the rate of inflation is falling. It just means the rate at which prices are rising.
Yeah, but it's still a good
fast.
story to tell if they'd been able to tell that story.
But as you say, Emily, it's not the story, weirdly enough, that quite a large phalanx of Tory MPs want to tell. The thing they care about most, this group, and we've seen 50 Conservative MPs today signing a motion in the Commons, the amendment to the King's Speech, which would basically override not just the ECHR but also our obligations with the UN with regards to the Refugee Convention and other bits of domestic legislation.
Well, Lee Anderson, the deputy chair, literally saying send them home.
Indeed, and the point about this
the
is,
flights in the air, send them home.
and there has been a growing kind of narrative within a part of the Conservative Party, the Conservative right in particular, which has been a hobby horse of theirs for a while now, which is this idea that somehow the government, it's kind of an extension of the Brexit sovereignty argument, that the government is being constantly stopped from doing what it wants to do as a result of new Labour era so-called domestic legal architecture, i.e. things like the Human Rights Act and international equivalents of that, the ECHR and the UN as well. It's more external enemies to fight, and this is going to fuel that. It's put it on steroids as a result of the Supreme Court judgment. And John, to go back to something you said earlier, we can see this some echoes of what's happened in the US, right? I mean, one of the big changes that's happened to the Republican Party, and indeed across the right generally in Europe as well over the last few years, is the right keeps having this internal battle between institutional, what you might say sort of pro-order forces, and anti-institutional forces, a group of whom their distaste for these structures goes up to the rule of law itself. And that is the fight that is taking place within so many conservative families, conservative parties, right-wing parties across Europe and the US at the moment. And you're seeing that play out in the UK at the moment. We kind of know where Sunak stands on that.
That is one of the definitions, obviously, of populism.
Indeed.
And we have a populist Conservative Party in part because they no longer want to see the guardrails up. Whether it's, the work of holding people accountable in the press, they've got GB News instead of, sort of giving interviews to journalists that don't actually work in their party, whether it's the rule of law, whether it's, the sense of Supreme Court, whether it's the institutions of Parliament, the Parliamentary Standards Committee, famously labelled by Boris Johnson a witch hunt. This whole idea that the very structures that we have in place, the guardrails of our democracy, just Stop
that's
you, frustrate you.
If
from
only there
doing
was
what
a
you want
minister
to
for
do.
common sense who could tell the Conservative Party to knock it on the head.
But that's the difference, right? Basically, between, as we've been talking about all week, in terms of the difference between policy between Sunak and Suella Braverman. In a way, it's not really about policy, as we were saying yesterday. That's the difference between them. Sunak fundamentally is more or less an institutionalist. He's on the institutional side of that right, of that fissure within the right, and Suella is on the other side. She's not an institutionalist. She actually sees these things as a problem. And that is the battle that the Conservative Party has been having and will continue to have.
She's a lawyer. She could have
she's
seen
a
all
KC,
this
she's
coming.
the Attorney General,
Right.
no less.
She was Attorney General. She could have seen all the
she
legal
knew.
problems.
She knew.
She knew.
Look, we've heard from James Cleverly what he thinks about the way forward is from the government. Worth listening to Yvette Cooper now in the Commons, where, of course, there are very strict rules on what is parliamentary and unparliamentary language.
I don't believe the new Home Secretary ever believed in the Rwanda plan. He distanced himself from it and his predecessor's language on it. He may even, on occasion, have privately called it batshit. But he and I agree. We need...
Oh, that's your fault, mateless.
No, that's your fault, John.
Why?
I think but maybe between you, with the language on this
We do
podcast.
believe in batshit. But interesting.
We've coarsened the whole sort of British
she broke her
norms on
confidence
this.
there, though, because presumably she's
obviously
heard him
heard
say
him
that
at
privately
parties.
and thought, yeah, I'm going to just throw that out there.
Yeah. And James Cleverly will have kind of smiled and also winced at the same time to be reminded of what he has been saying.
But also probably not mind being in a different boat, to Suella Braverman.
I think there are an awful lot of Tories who are very keen to be in a different boat from Suella Braverman at the moment. In a moment, we'll be speaking to the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee for her take on what is unfolding in the Conservative Party right now.
We haven't talked to you about Suella's letter yet. My, was that a work of art? We're going to come on to that in a moment. But first, let's hear from Alicia Kearns. She's the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. And in that role, actually will be one of the few people or the few bodies that can hold David Cameron from the Lords as Foreign Secretary to account.
Alicia Kearns, thank you very much for being with us. The government has lost its case in the Supreme Court today, yet there are a lot of MPs who are saying, well, just ignore the law, let's kick them out the same day. I mean, Lee Anderson, the Deputy Chair of the Conservative Party, is one of those saying that. Others are saying we ought to pull out of the European Convention on Human Rights. What's the way forward?
So look, obviously the government will be very disappointed. This is one of their flagship policies, and it comes on a day where they have managed to meet their inflation targets and their goals. But the reality is, it is important that we have a robust and independent judiciary. This is what makes us such a strong democracy, which makes us a rule of law nation. For myself, I refused to vote for the Rwanda policy. It wasn't something that I personally backed because I did question the legality of it. A lot of it along the basis of exactly what the judiciary have concluded today. We will hear from the Prime Minister. We will have heard from him by the time this goes out. But ultimately, he needs to now come back with a plan for how he wants to go forward.
So what is your response to Lee Anderson when he says we ignore the law and just send them back the same day that they arrive?
Look, the whole point of Britain is that we are a proud rule of law nation. If we stop being that, we lose our ability to be an arbiter on the world stage. We lose our credibility with our partners. We lose our credibility around the world. We are not here to undermine our judiciary. We are here to challenge. We are here to change our legal system where necessary. But we should be very cautious about just outright attacks on our judiciary.
It's not just Lee Anderson, Alicia, and I know you probably don't want to dwell on individual MPs, but we're hearing it's up to 50 who want to disable not just the ECHR, but the UN Refugee Convention. And fundamentally, this just goes to basic domestic UK immigration law. There are 50 people in your party who don't seem to think it matters anymore.
Well, I obviously fundamentally disagree with them. And I think on the ECHR, my colleagues, if they spent the time looking at it, would recognise that undermining the ECHR could be dangerous to anyone in public life. If we start undermining those institutions that protect their freedom of speech, their freedom to speak out in the way that they wish to and should have the right to do so, undermining the ECHR is exactly the kind of thing that would undermine the exact kind of counterpoints we constantly make when it comes to freedom of speech and freedom to be able to raise your voices whenever you want to be able to have those debates.
And just can I read you something from the Mail Online, which I've just seen, which is that 6 more Tory backbenchers are sending in letters of no confidence in Rishi Sunak as Suella Braverman's allies threaten a grid of to topple the PM in the wake of the Rwanda migrant disaster.
Look, I think that's a very poor choice of language. I certainly don't know 50 colleagues who have put in letters. And ultimately, look, we need grown-up governance at this point in time. And actually, that goes for the whole of my party. So I think my message would be to colleagues, get a grip, get on with the job, stop spending time wanting to launch some kind of counter-revolution. And I think actually Rishi needs to call out the right if they are going to try and launch this sort of activity. It's completely unhelpful. And actually, often those who bang on most about the fact we need to be a unified party are those that seem to be quite happy to be sowing division now.
Call out the right how?
Well, I think sacking Suella is one way of doing so, but essentially refusing to allow them to bully him into somehow changing his positions. He needs to consult with the whole of our party. He needs to reflect the whole of our party. But there are some fundamentals that have to be respected. And look, if colleagues want to throw their toys out the pram, that has to just be allowed for them to do so, and they have every right to speak out, but not for us to necessarily shape our decisions based on that.
There is a primary question in the whole Rwanda policy, Alicia, of pure incompetence on this. The UK government was told a year ago that the Rwanda Memorandum of Understanding should be a treaty. It should be actually worked out as a treaty, not a Memorandum of Understanding which was, flimsy, not worth the paper it's written on. The government knew that. Suella knew that. Rishi Sunak knew that. Why did they put us all through this and put it all through the courts when they could see, they were already told that it wouldn't go through?
Well, I think the government was genuinely working with the best interests in mind and wanting to get the best possible outcome for what is an incredibly difficult case. And it is something that comes up on doorsteps across the country. As I said, I don't agree with the way in which you've gone about it. I didn't think it was the right way to do it. But one of the reasons why I took the position I did is I don't necessarily have an alternative that I think we can be pushing forward that will achieve the same goals. But I would say I would have done more on the focus they have had, for example, with Albania and other countries, which has worked. Other measures have worked to bring down migration. There are other ways of doing about this, and that's what the government will now need to focus on.
Alicia, can I just ask you about one other aspect of the reshuffle? And you talked a moment ago about the sacking of Suella Braverman. James Cleverly is now the Home Secretary. And David Cameron, Lord Cameron, is now the Foreign Secretary. Questions raised today by the Leader of the Opposition and questions similarly raised by Ian Duncan Smith about David Cameron's contacts with China and the business he might have done with Chinese state enterprises. How worried are you about that?
So look, obviously I want, as you've seen from my record in Parliament, I've been very tough when it comes to China. Lord Cameron returns to Parliament at a time where Parliament has gone through an enormous revolution in terms of our approach to China, our views on China, and recognition of the enormous threats that China poses. I will give him that blank slate. I will give him that opportunity to show that he is working primarily in the interest of our economic security and national security, and I want to see him rise to those. But yes, of course, I do have questions and I do have concerns, and I've raised those over the last few years with some of the choices he's made. But ultimately, I want him to now prove that he will take the right course. And the reality is, David Cameron, Lord Cameron, reports to Parliament, not the other way around. And Parliament has been very clear on what we want to see from the Foreign Office.
This doesn't just go back to his policy, though, when he was in office as Prime Minister, Alicia. This goes back to what he was doing in sort of the corporate world with, a Sri Lanka speech in a Chinese government just a few weeks ago.
Absolutely, without question. So look, when he was in government, I disagree fundamentally with the fact that he had the golden era, but you have to have hope in diplomacy. So the fact that he tried to have a better relationship with China, that he tried to bring them on board with our values and our economies and everything else, that was the right thing to do. But he hadn't planned to fail. And that was what left us vulnerable. In the private world, some of the choices he has made are absolutely ones that I had grave concerns about. Anything that gives legitimacy to the Belt and Road Initiative was not a good idea. But now I'm going to let him have that opportunity to show a reset and to show that the approach he is going to take is one that puts our national interests first. And I expect to see him be making the tough choices on China because that is what is needed.
But you're happy for him to carry on without those questions having been answered clearly about his links. I'm just surprised that you're sort of giving him that latitude, given your concerns, which you've just expressed.
Oh, I think you can be pretty confident that I'll be asking some very specific questions and some very tough questions, but I have a manner in which to do that, which is in front of my committee. And at that point, I can assure you that as I will from day one, I will be holding Lord Cameron to account in a very detailed way.
Alicia Kearns, thanks very much. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much. Before we go, we've just realised we haven't even mentioned Suella's letter, which in the Hall of Fame of resignation letters, it has to loom large, because I can't remember anything like it. I mean, Geoffrey Howe's resignation speech, Norman Lamont's in office but not in power.
But you know what? A lot of people have been making that comparison, right? The Howe resignation speech against Thatcher.
Oh, just call me cliche.
No.
He means that
I would
news
never
did
dream
last
it.
night.
I'd never dream it. You know, the difference was, right, which precipitated Thatcher's fall. That had a dignity to it. I mean, I actually think that, you know, in terms of some of the reactions to this letter from Suella, which was, you know, it was dripping in acid, and
We
obviously
need to get Gabriel, don't we, to voice it up.
Well, that's true. He is our resident impressionist, of course. Having done such a good job of reminding us of Lee Anderson last Friday, I'm sure he could probably do it better, Suella, to be honest.
Somebody needs to be honest. Your plan is not working. We have endured record election defeats. Your resets have failed. We're running out of time. You need to change course urgently. That was the nice bit.
Well, my favourite bit is at the very top where she's like, "You've asked me to step down from the government. It's for the best."
Yeah, like,
believe me, I'm not bothered.
It's the most ugly breakup ever, isn't it?
But she also talks about this secret sort of deal
the contract.
The contract, well, the non-contract, the sort of the memorandum of understanding, perhaps, that they drew up, where he allegedly promised her something, and she says he went back on it, and this is all of his. Yeah, exactly.
You know, like, who cares? I mean, honestly, the thing about it is that, you know, the whole thesis of that letter is that she wasn't allowed to do what was necessary to basically implement the Rwanda plan. She knew this was coming today, so it was her getting ahead of it and trying to shape the narrative. The truth is, as we've already discussed, it was never going to happen, and insofar as it might have done, like, she was the Home Secretary. Like, she did have some ownership over it, and she passed the Illegal Migration Act, which she told us would sort out the small boats problem, and it hasn't done so, albeit the numbers have reduced, as the Prime Minister was reminding us, by about a quarter or so by comparison to last year. And I actually think, in terms of the reaction to it, it's not done her a whole body of good with even Conservative MPs who would instinctively be on her side. Philip Davis, the husband of the Minister for Common Sense, of course, Esther McVeigh, has basically accused GB News, host, has said that she's had a bit of a sort of hissy fit, which happens sometimes.
Fundamentally,
so she's a fundamental.
Just listen to Alicia Kearns, who's a kind of chair of the.
But I think, fundamentally,
committee.
this is not about policy. What we have to remember is these are the starting firing shots of Suella Braverman's campaign to be the next Conservative Party leader from the outside after Rishi Sunak. And so I think, in a way, it doesn't really matter. Like, the Rwanda stuff doesn't matter anymore. Going back to James Cleverly's point, which is that maybe we shouldn't make policy based on internal Conservative rows, that wasn't just a joke. He's kind of saying, could we not do that for a week, please?
I tell you the difference, though, with Suella Braverman's letter, is that normally, in that sort of situation, you write a resignation letter more in sorrow than in anger.
Fired,
I will, of course,
resigned.
support you from the backbenches. Brackets, I really want you to fail so I can succeed you. There is no brackets here. It is absolutely, you are a and I want you to be destroyed by what happens next. And that is the tone of the letter of Suella Braverman to Rishi Sunak.
Can't wait for John's resignation.
Oh, it's going to be an absolute humdinger.
No, if you're nasty to me, it will come very soon. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.